In the year 2000, in the parking lot behind Midway Games, an arcade cabinet sat next to a dumpster. The unassuming cabinet wouldn't be anything special to the casual passerby, just something that looked a lot like a stand-up Battlezone cabinet. Something there was thousands of at one point in time. Only, there was something oddly special about this unit. Instead of Battlezone, the unit read Bradley Trainer, a relic of when Atari almost became a military contractor. This is a story of how the US military, Atari, and a government contractor tried to make an arcade military simulator. Atari in the late 70s was at the pinnacle of their prestige and technological edge. At the turn of the 80s, in terms of arcade entertainment, they were unmatched. Atari had an impressive technology, and just about everyone was taking notice. The military and all the industry around it observed with keen, calculated interest into what this new entertainment technology could bring to the table.
Baseball is an old, established sport that has become a big business. But there are newer games that also have become immensely popular and profitable. And one of them in particular may even be used by the Army to help in training and recruiting. Pentagon correspondent David Ensor has that story.
Battlezone. It's one of a new generation of electronic games that are taking Americans by storm. Especially male Americans, who flock to arcades like this one around the country to do battle with the machines. In the games, you are fighting enemy forces, and the object is to get them before they get you, which is exactly the idea in a real war for a tank gunner, or say the gunner driver of one of the Army's new M2 infantry fighting vehicles. And that gave the Army an idea.
It'd be awfully nice to be able to go downstairs if we were both gunners and spend 30 minutes each day kind of resharpening or rehoning our skills without the problem of loading up in vehicles and driving 50 miles out to find a range where you could fire.
It would be awfully nice, and it would also save on ammunition, fuel, and spare parts. The cost of them is skyrocketing. So the Army Training Command recently asked the Atari Game Company to adapt one of their Battlezone games to have the controls, characteristics, and sounds of an infantry fighting vehicle. Be careful of that enemy tank. But wait, get the helicopter first. That's the bigger threat to you. Army officers were delighted with the machine and planned by this October to contract with a game company to build about 10 more, this time to resemble the gunner's controls on the Army's standard M60 tank.
Put them in clubs, in messes, maybe put them in break rooms, put them down in the motor pool, and find out whether or not soldiers will do this on their own and what kind of feedback we get.
The Army will then study whether the games improve the hand-eye coordination and accuracy of their gunners. If so, they may order hundreds of them and have them adapted for their purposes. And there's even talk of using electronic games as a recruiting gimmick.
You walk past one of these commercial arcades, and I think we all have walked in through a shopping mall, and you watch the volume of people, the quantity of people who are wandering in and out those doors, and they're all seized with the competitive edge of running these machines. Something's happening in there. I know that the Army would like to capitalize on that.
A capitalization that calls for an investment of only 25 cents at a time.
During the 1970s and into the early 80s, the United States military had been working on a number of new weapons platforms to replace aging pieces of hardware. Namely the Abrams, which became the United States' main battle tank and arguably one of the best tanks to ever hit the battlefield. Around that same time, the Bradley fighting vehicle was introduced in 1981. The new platform at this point was meant to counter heavily armored and equally armed Russian BMP troop transports, which left the Bradley in a bit of a strange area of armored warfare. It was primarily a troop transport, only it was much more heavily armed and loaded with all manner of weapons, which ultimately limited its troop carrying capabilities, because the armaments took seats away from soldiers it was supposed to originally carry. So the Bradley was armed to the teeth with tow missiles and a 25mm cannon, which could toggle on the fly between armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds. The Bradley had a unique position within the armored community of being an infantry support vehicle. It was never meant to be as strong as a tank, but it was certainly lethal enough to take one out with its array of armaments. But being a more light tank, it couldn't take hits from anti-tank weapons. The vehicle has a controversial place in history, given the attention given to its development by media retellings like the film The Pentagon Wars. The Bradley, however, has served well in its designated roles, which have expanded to much more than just infantry support over its close to 40 years of service within the United States military. In 1980, a bit before the official entry date of the Bradley into service, there were some interesting actions taken. The first was Atari was approached by an entity to create a modified version of Battlezone that could be used to simulate operations inside a Bradley fighting vehicle. The true makeup of the organization that approached Atari isn't 100% understood, as there are conflicting reports from primary sources and news media outlets from the time. The media reports state that it was Army TRADOC Command that approached Atari, TRADOC being the head of training for the United States Army. The news outlets claim that TRADOC approached Atari about converting a cabinet and then has some rather in-depth footage along with an interview with the U.S. Army Colonel Robert Harrington. Although his interview is rather chopped up, to the point that it never states if the Army was actually the one who ordered the cabinet, but rather talks about the advantages a digital gunnery system could provide. There is another story about a company created by retired generals who brokered the deal with Atari on behalf of the Army. But either story is possible, whether it was TRADOC or a group of retired generals, because either way the story is told, the company or organization driving the deal got Atari connections with FMC, the government contractor building the Bradleys. Atari developers were given access to Bradley fighting vehicles at the FMC manufacturing plant, located just a stone's throw away from Atari in San Jose. The visit was to give cabinet designers a better idea as to how to bring the Bradley fighting vehicle's unique characteristics physically to an arcade cabinet, along with its unique wireframe vector graphics. Atari's corporate culture was equally secretive about the project, with little information being available, at least from the business side of Atari. Little information was even fed to the men working on the project, so it's no surprise the lack of information still to this day about it. It was literally just like out of the movies. There was a big black sedan. He said, "You can bring a pad of paper and a pencil and a tape measure." I said, "Okay." He says, "You're going to take all the notes you need and just come back with that, and then see what you can come up with." So the day was arranged, and as I recall, it was a big black Ford Crown Victoria. I can't recall now if the driver was civilian or military. I don't recall. But I do remember it had a car phone, literally the old-fashioned, complete Western, Bell system type handset, with a coil cord right there on the center console. It was a short drive, of course, from Sunnyvale to FMC's facility. He gets on the phone and dials a few numbers, and I hear him talk to somebody, and the rolling gate just opens up, and we drive onto the property. The gate closes behind us, and he's still on the phone. He's talking to somebody, and then the next thing I know, an overhead door on this warehouse, which is concrete, tilts up. This overhead door is opening up. It's bright daylight, and I can't really see inside because it's very dark. The car just pulls into the warehouse, and then the door goes down behind us. Mike Cuero, romship.org. Mike Cuero, armed only with a sketch pad, as he wasn't allowed to bring a camera, entered the assembly plant for the Bradley fighting vehicle. There were some introductions made, and Mike was allowed to see inside one of the Bradleys. He was escorted by a lieutenant and a photographer, who would photograph whatever Mike wanted, but the photos would have to be reviewed and sent to him with whatever sensitive information was removed. Mike was an industrial designer, so it was his job to get the aesthetics of the controls right from the Bradley. But it wasn't his job to design the game itself. Mike was solely concerned with working to adapt what Atari had to the physical space of the Bradley gunner. Mike spent a while measuring the controls and the items in the gunnery position, trying to get his best sense of it. The cabinet would be used by the military, and they would know if something was dramatically off. So Mike spent time trying to get the best, most accurate assessment out of the time he had with the Bradley. Because they wouldn't know if I did it wrong. Nobody else at Atari would know, because as far as I know, I was the only one to sit in one. Mike Cuero, romship.org. Mike came out of the experience with a pretty solid sense of the gunner's position. He also came away from the Bradley fighting vehicle with a detailed sketch of the Bradley gunner's controls, which were very unique for the time, with the articulation the controls offered. Vertical and horizontal movements were very fluid and easy to pick up. Atari liked the controller so much it ended up being recycled for the Star Wars arcade games. Jerry Leichhardt and Otto D. Runts built the controller for the cabinet, as it was wholly unique and couldn't be replicated from existing Atari components. Mike worked on modifying existing Battlezone stand-up cabinets to try and get something that would be as close as possible to the experience, without Atari having to do any major retooling of existing molds. This was Atari. Oh yeah, this again. At this point in time, was just a prototype. I mean, maybe if the project had gone on longer, there would have been something custom done. But for the purposes of demonstrating to the Army what those kids in Sunnyvale can do, I had to work with what I had. So there are those two large windows on either side of the player's viewport, and those are the panels that I then, removed and replaced to basically put the controls. I had to work within the confines of the vacuum-formed housing part. That's where I put the controls and the location to the operator, as close as possible to what I saw that day. Mike Guerra, ROMchip.org. With the information provided from the field trip to the Bradley production line, Mike was able to start work on the cabinet. 2 prototypes are known for sure to exist from this project. However, Mike thinks there might have been as many as 5 produced for the Army. The other 3 units have not been located, as it's most likely only 2 were ever produced. The cabinets were not built in a traditional manner, as there wasn't any type of marketing controls that had to be bothered with in the cabinet's production. They were basically just modifying existing cabinets with little extra added for a proof of concept. There wasn't a need to sell the units to arcades, so much of the standard development practices were skipped for this project. Not many meetings aside from making sure the cabinets were close enough to the Army specs for a prototype. The project moved forward with it taking roughly 2 weeks for Atari to get the design done of the physical cabinets. The game that ran in the cabinets was an entirely different affair that had its own problems within Atari to overcome. Some developers within Atari refused to work on the project because of its association with the Army, most notably original Battlezone programmer Ed Rotberg. Rotberg only came on board after he was promised by management that he would never be asked to do anything with the military in the future. Ed spoke of his time working on the project in an article in Synergy magazine. First of all, I don't want to be working on Army stuff. I could have done that when I was at Texas Instruments. I'm a pacifist. I don't want to get involved in this stuff. And he said, well, we promised. So I said, well, look, I'll make you a deal. If I do this, if I get this done on time, then I don't have to have anything to do with anything involving the government or Army from here out. And they promised. So I lost 3 or 4 months of my life living there. My wife would see me only in the morning and in the evening, and I got the thing done. It was a prototype. It worked. It was reasonably bug-free. And the idea was that it would train gunners about the weapon systems and about identifying silhouettes of friendly versus enemy vehicles and that type of thing. The project came together, and the 2 known prototypes were finished and then rushed off to military conference events. An anonymous source spoke to mikesarcade.com about the project. ABZ was a rush project. When it was 85 to 90% done, it was hauled off to a military conference, we were told, where it was a big hit, we were told, and then returned. I remember the 1 prototype, but there may have been 2. One of the team members kept the prototype. A few months after the presumed conference, I asked Rick, the project leader, if we were going to produce it. He said no, but I don't remember if he gave me a reason, or if anyone had even given him a reason. Anonymous source, mikesarcade.com. The product that was ultimately sent out to be reviewed by the Army wasn't finished. It was semi-functional but wasn't 100% complete, which raises questions about the cabinet and what ultimately happened to the 2 cabinets we know exist. There are conflicting stories about the cabinets ending up in Korea. However, those are unconfirmed and are more rumor mill stories reminiscent of those of Polybius. But around the mid-1980s, the US military had other simulators coming into service, so it's possible people got those confused with what they thought Atari had made, as there were news reports from the early 1980s about the Atari cabinet. There were also news reports written in 1981 that seemingly confused the MK60 simulator with Atari. Still, the Defense Department, which must train a large number of refugees from arcades, seems convinced Fort Eustis, near Williamsburg, Virginia, recruits play a version of Battlezone that targets realistic silhouettes of enemy tanks, helicopters, and armored personnel carriers. Atari consultants also helped the Army create a tabletop tank gunnery game, all its own, the MK60, which carries a $15,000 price tag and 30 complex programs. It's important to have training devices that don't appear so obvious to be training devices, says Major Jack Thorpe of the Pentagon's Advanced Research Project Agency. The MK60 was a Laserdisc-based simulator that had been in development since 1979. But thanks to this paragraph from an article written in 1981, it has seemingly led to people confusing the 2 different projects for decades. Reviews even came out about the Atari cabinets during their time away from Atari, making the media circuit trying to impress the United States Army into following up on the project. New York Times, July 10, 1982. While parents and school officials fret over the grip video games have on the nation's children, the United States Army is experimenting with the games to see if they can be of some practical use in modern weaponry training. The Army's Training and Doctrine Command has asked Atari, a major manufacturer of video games, to come up with a modified version of its Battlezone for training gunners for the Army's new heavily armed M2 personnel transport. Soldiers win points for knocking out the tanks and helicopters of the Warsaw Pact countries on the screen, but if they hit a friendly war machine, they are penalized to the tune of the 1812 Overture. New York Times, July 25, 1982. The military services are trying to decide who might best sit at the controls of their evolving electronic weapons. Preliminary tests cited by some experts suggest that pilots with good psychomotor skills also do well at video games. No one is considering Pac-Man yet as a recruiting device, but the Army is evaluating a version of Atari's Battlezone tank video game, altered to show the silhouettes of Soviet war machines, and programming a $4,000 video game over a $50 million simulator. An extra bit of realism on the target screen can't hurt. Ultimately, what Atari made was never pursued by the military into anything other than a handful of prototype cabinets. The military is a slow-moving beast when it comes to developing new technology. And with the rate at which game technology was advancing in the 1980s, it's really not shocking that the military wouldn't adopt a standalone arcade cabinet for training purposes, as simulators like SimNet were just over the horizon. Those were platforms that focused on command and control and communication more so than gameplay. There was also something to say about the timing of the cabinet's development. The Bradley fighting vehicle was just put into service, so anything associated with it only boosted the platform's public notoriety with the weapons platform. And it often competing for federal dollars, it's not a surprise that some type of PR blitz might have been planned to bolster the public interest. Also, you had a change of command in the U.S. Army TRADOC, with General Glenn K. Otis replaced by General William R. Richardson, who assumed command of TRADOC in 1983 as the commanding general. So it's possible that once General Richardson took over, he scrapped parts of the project. A passage published in Computer Image Generation in 1983 might support this theory. The Army's Training and Doctrine Command, TRADOC, has completed an extensive study of arcade game technology and its application to military instruction. Under contract of TRADOC's Training Support Center, Atari has modified their popular Battlezone game into Army Battlezone, in which the controls of the weapons of the M2 infantry fighting vehicle are replicated. Army experts who have worked with the game find it to be a useful tactical trainer. A more sophisticated version is in the works. But a year later in 1984, Fort Knox concluded a field trial with the MK60 simulator, where this one line is mentioned in a footnote. It was originally planned that two simulators would be examined, the MK60 and the Battlezone game manufactured by Atari Inc. However, the latter device was not made available. Field trials of the MK60 tank gunnery simulator in armored institutional training courses. The cabinets appear to have never actually made it to training sites. The cabinets made the rounds for the media circuits, but seemingly never ended up being reviewed by the Army for their potential as tactical trainers, which raises more questions that I can't really give you a solid answer for. But the fact that the report states that the units were manufactured by Atari might indicate that it was actually Atari who pushed more for the unit's creation than any third-party organization. But a final potential reason as to why the project didn't happen was because of the culture of Atari at the time. Ed Rottenberg, like many folks at Atari, were of the post-Vietnam War generation that wanted little to nothing to do with the military, and it wasn't something they wanted to take part in. So finding talent at Atari who were willing to work on these projects might have been a tougher sale. But ultimately, what we ended up with was a fascinating story about how the military and a game company tried to adapt arcade technology to train soldiers. Thanks for watching The Historic Nerd today. Appreciate you dropping by and watching the entire video. If you're interested in more content like this, please go and check out some of my other content on this channel, or you can go to www.historicalnerd.com. If you're interested in bugging me directly, feel free to @ me at historicalnerd on twitter.com. But also, if you're interested in, just talking to the channel or participating in the community more often, there is a weekly stream I often do on Friday and Saturday evenings. But I definitely want to thank you guys for dropping by and hanging out and doing whatever you're doing. You have a wonderful day, evening, night, or whatever it is you're doing. Bye.